down 200 or 300 yards of three-strand barbed wire fence, which in those days was the only boundary between the two countries. Came in on horseback, left their horses behind a little hill on the southwest side of Columbus, and most of them came into town on foot. They succeeded in burning 4 or 5 significant buildings in the middle of Columbus, looting a number of others, and killing a total of 18 Americans, 10 of whom were civilians. Columbus was defended by the 13th Cavalry. It was its headquarters, but the cavalry was responsible for an area approximately 50 miles east of Columbus to the Boot Heel, an area more than 100 miles long in width. So consequently, at the time of the raid, there were only a couple of troops that were actually in Columbus. And although there was some indication that Villa was in the area and might well want to attack the United States, it was unclear, and no specific defensive measures were taken other than the usual patrols. After the raid, President Wilson ordered General Pershing to lead a force into Mexico to chastise Villa. The 1st Aero Squadron was part of that force. The squadron consisted of 8 Jenny JN2s, Jennies, Curtiss JN2s. They were the first. They had been purchased in May and June of 1915. 2 of the planes had already been wrecked in either Oklahoma or Texas later that year, with the death of one observer aboard one of the planes. Major Captain Knox of the Quartermaster Corps was serving as an observer. The pilots became so afraid of the planes that they essentially refused to fly them anymore. They said they were not reliable, they didn't have enough power, they were unstable, they couldn't control them. Belatedly, the planes were tested in a wind tunnel, or a model of the planes was tested and determined, yes, they were indeed unstable. Curtiss came out, modified the remaining 6 planes by changing the wing structure and the tail structure and adding supposedly heavier engines. An expert at the time said, well, the extra engine weighed more, with the greater strength, weighed more than the preceding engine, and the additions to the plane also caused the plane to weigh more, so they kind of came out even on that. But at least the new planes were more stable. They could be flown. Curtiss also provided 2 JN3s from scratch. Brought the squadron up to 8 planes, supposedly JN3s. They arrived in Columbus on March 15th, 1916, aboard a train from El Paso. Besides the 8 Jennies, they had 12 trucks, 6 motorcycles, 11 pilots, a medical officer, a couple of corpsmen, and 82 enlisted men, and also a civilian mechanic whose name is, everybody remembers, good old Jacob. In any case, they arrived on the 15th and immediately started, the planes had been disassembled before they shipped them on the train. So they immediately started putting them back together, and late that afternoon, Lieutenant Herb Darg took number 43 up for a little spin just to try it out. In his diary, he said that he crossed into Mexico just a little bit, therefore claiming to be the first American pilot to fly into enemy territory for the U.S. Army. The next day, Commander Benny Falloy and Captain Dodd took number 44 up on an official scouting mission into Mexico. They flew into Mexico about 20 miles and looked around searching for whatever, and came back with nothing really to report, but that was the official entry. Well, on the 19th, Pershing had already gone down to Casas Grandes. For those who are familiar with northern Mexico, that's about 150 miles or so south of the border. Had already gone down to the Casas Grandes area and had set up a base there in Colonia Dublan. He contacted the Aero Squadron and said he really wanted them down there right now, post-haste. Well, Falloy took the orders literally, even though that meant that they would be flying at night. Now, these Jennies were trainers to begin with, and they were miserable planes. They had no lights. They had no instrumentation other than handheld compasses. They had no armament. They had no weaponry whatsoever. And they were 2-seaters, I think. That's obvious. But Falloy ordered the squadron into the air, so at 10 past 5 in the afternoon, March 19th, the squadron took off from just a pasture area east of Columbus, one by one, and headed south. The plan was that Floyd and Dodd being the pilot and Floyd his observer, would lead the way, and the other 7 planes would follow them one by one, hoping that after dark they would be able to see the exhaust of the plane ahead of them so they could stay together. The plan broke down almost immediately. Lieutenant Kilner's plane barely cleared the wire fence at the end of the field. He just missed it. So he made a tight little circle, turned around, landed, was left behind. They ended up spending a good deal of the night. They actually replaced the engine. The engines in the JN2s were OX engines. They replaced them to make them JN3s. They replaced them with OXX engines. So they replaced the engine with OX, which indicates that although supposedly the planes that had come to Columbus were JN3s, they weren't really all of them that. Some were partially converted, some of them completely, but not totally, not the whole squadron. So Kilner's back at Columbus. The other 7 are heading south, following each other. As it started to get dark about dusk, Floyd spotted some dust near Ascension and thought it was U.S. cavalry. Decided that maybe, since it was getting dark, that the best thing to do was to land. So he did. 3 of the other planes followed him. 3 of them didn't. Dog was flying about 1,000 feet lower than the leaders and didn't see them go. Lieutenants Gorell and Willis were flying about 1,000 feet higher. They managed to stay together for a while, but didn't see Floyd land. He landed, and the 6th Infantry actually was there, and they provided guides for the plane and so forth, and they had a comfortable evening. The other 3 flyers continued south into Mexico. And it got darker and darker. Willis and Gorell stayed together for a while, and then finally they lost sight of each other and separated. Willis flying a little further south than Gorell kind of heading north or west. Incidentally, when Floyd when he received his orders to go into Mexico, he requested that a field be identified, that fires be lit, and so forth. And this is what they were looking for, were fires on the ground to identify where their field would be. Willis and Gorell had separated, going their different ways, and they both finally saw fire. Willis turned west toward it. Gorell saw the same fire to the south and came back, and at some undetermined time, in the pitch black, they almost collided. They came right close to each other, spotted each other again, and then immediately went on in the different directions. They found out very quickly that the fire they were looking at was actually a forest fire. So Gorell turned, continued south, and Willis turned and continued south. Gorell continued heading more or less west and finally turned north. Willis flew until he was really getting low on fuel. He estimated that he was probably about out, and he finally spotted another fire, and he was just hoping that this was the place that he should land. He searched around, and he found an area that from the sky at least looked like it was possible that he might be able to make it. So he came down, set his plane down on the ground, and it turned out that the ground was a good deal rougher than what it looked like from 1,000 feet. He tore the undercarriage completely out of the plane, damaged it beyond hope for him to repair, to get it in the air again. And when he searched out his fire, he found that he was close to the railroad, and a railroad tie was aflame. So, while checking out the flame, the burning tie, he was approached by several people on horseback, and they were kind of hailing him, of course in Spanish, and he was concerned about that. He's in Chihuahua, in Mexico. Mexicans then didn't really like Americans all that much anyway. And also Chihuahua is Vista country. This is where Pancho Villa got his strength from. So understandably the pilots felt that the chances were, whenever he encountered Mexican, that they were unlikely to be friendly. So Willis's only recourse was he hid. He got down behind the railroad embankment and hid out till the riders left, went on their way. He started walking, following the railroad track north. He was, by the way, approximately 6 miles south of Pearson. Pearson is now Mata Ortiz. Perhaps some of you are aware of the Mata Ortiz pottery that's become quite saleable and important. But in those days, it was a little town named Pearson. So he started walking north, following the railroad track. It took him essentially a day and a half. At 2 o'clock in the morning on the 21st, he reached Colonia Dublin at the camp, walking back. The next day, they organized a search party to go down to try to recover the plane. It was just a small group of people. They got near Pearson and they were fired on. They felt that they couldn't defend themselves, so they turned around and went back to Malrotis. I went back to Casas Grandes. And then from there, they waited another day or two. They organized a larger organization, and they went back down to try to get this plane, number 41 in this case. They found the plane had been stripped. The only thing left that was usable was the engine. So they salvaged the engine and took it back, and we've crossed one of the 8 planes off the list already. Meanwhile, Gorel, after flying north, just decided to continue north. With a flashlight, he could see his compass, so he held a north azimuth, figuring, well, he was going to fly to the United States or Canada, whichever came first. And he flew until he literally ran out of gas. Fortunately, when he came down to a field of bunch grass. There was a herd of mixed cattle and horses close by. He didn't hit any of them. Managed to land, came to a stop. To his west were several buildings, little adobe buildings they turned out to be. He thought that he could see figures moving around those buildings. So when he got out of his plane, he figured, well, I got to do something. I can't just stay here. And he could just make out in the gloom that north of him was a hill, a small mountain or a large hill. And he decided that if he got to the top of that mountain, he could get his bearings about where he was and where he should go next. He found there was a stream between him and the mountain. In fact, that's one of the reasons why he landed there. He had been able to see the silvery stream at night, and he was able to land just south of it. So he started walking toward it. Well, when he saw people over by the buildings, or at least he thought he saw people, he decided that maybe he ought to crawl. So Grell got down on his hands and knees, and he's crawling along through this bunch grass. Well, that attracted the attention of the herd. And they came over, curiosity, kind of check him out. And now, Edgar Gorell's nickname was Nap for Napoleon. He was a small man. And he says, I had heard stories about herds of animals trampling things that were crawling on the ground. So after crawling a little while on these animals right there, he decided maybe he should get up and run, which he did. Jumped up and ran towards the stream. The herd ran after him. They were chasing him. And he got to the stream and he didn't stop. He was hoping it's not too deep. And he raced across the stream, splashing away. Fortunately, it wasn't. And the herd also fortunately stopped at the stream. So he got across, he climbed the mountain, spent the rest of the night resting. In the morning at daylight, he started walking west. He walked until, I think he said 3:45 in the afternoon, and had run out of water, or just about out, and had found no other water, no sign of habitation, no clue about where Americans were and whatnot, and he decided his only hope was to get back to the stream where he knew there was water. So he turned around, and at approximately 10 o'clock that night, he finally made it back to the stream. He said that he actually collapsed a couple of times and passed out, and slept. He knew he slept for a while, a couple of times. He finally got up, he finally made it to the stream, he got some water and so forth, and got through the night. The next morning, nice and early, he managed to catch one of the horses. So he's standing there, they wore coveralls, and he's trying to tear strips off his coveralls to make reins and a bridle for the horse. When a Mexican approached him on horseback, and the guy starts yelling at him in Spanish. So Gorell turned and ran and inside one of the adobe buildings, the buildings he had determined were empty. Got inside one of the buildings. The Mexican was riding around and around the building, yelling at him in Spanish. And Gorell drew his revolver and is running from window to window, confronting the Mexican with his revolver in hand, yelling, "Amigo, amigo." He said,